this fourth Sunday of Advent, let us begin with a word from Paul's letter to the Romans. We have in chapter 13, beginning with verse 8, "Owe no one anything except to love one another, for the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. The commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandment are summed up in this word, love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfilling of the law." Now, hear this word from the law of Moses, from the Torah. We're going all the way back to Deuteronomy chapter 24, starting with verse 19. "When you reap your harvest in your field and forget a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back to get it. It shall be left for the alien, the orphan, and the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all your undertakings. When you beat your olive trees, do not strip what is left. It shall be for the alien, the orphan, and the widow. When you gather the grapes of your vineyard, do not glean what is left. It shall be for the alien, the orphan, and the widow. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Therefore, I am commanding you to do this." And now, final reading. Hear the good news according to the Gospel of Luke. We're in chapter 2. "In those days, a decree went out from Emperor Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was the first registration and was taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. All went to their own towns to be registered. Joseph also went from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to the city of David called Bethlehem, because he was descended from the house and family of David. He went to be registered with Mary, to whom he was engaged and who was expecting a child. While they were there, the time came for her to deliver her child. And she gave birth to her firstborn son and wrapped him in bands of cloth and laid him in a manger, because there was no place for them in the guest room." What a disparity among that set of texts. The first two speak of love, of neighbor, and extending that love in concrete ways for the poor, the vulnerable, even the foreigners. But that last text, the gospel, the good news, as it were, includes this infamously bleak detail of Jesus' birth. His first bed was a farm animal's feed trough because there was no more space in the guest room. For a people trained to both give and receive radical hospitality, this was a rather humble offering for the Son of God. In spite of Micah's prophecy that indicated the Messiah should be born in Bethlehem, it does not appear to have been the greatest place Jesus could have landed. What was so great about Bethlehem? Was it even a great place at all? According to scripture, like Micah's verse and song, it was nothing but a little town, nothing compared to the neighboring city of Jerusalem. The little town of Bethlehem was the rustic little place that fed the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Need a lamb to sacrifice in the temple? You could buy one raised on the plains of Bethlehem. Need bread? Bethlehem grew lots of barley. In fact, the very name of the town means house of bread. Other than that, there was nothing so great about Bethlehem, except for a little bit of history, Bethlehem's main claim to fame. You see, Bethlehem was not only the birthplace of Jesus, but of his most famous ancestor, none other than King David. That sounds pretty impressive, right? David did some impressive things, all right. Once he moved his kingdom headquarters to nearby Jerusalem, he built an impressive palace for himself. Politically, he did some notable things. He unified the 12 tribes of Israel, making them a great nation by regional standards. But not everything David did was great. We may recall the incident in which King David raped a married woman, then had her husband murdered to cover up his own crime. David's sons would grow to be just as terrible to women. One of them even raped his own sister. And guess what Daddy David did to punish his son? Nothing. David's sons were out of control, plotting to kill each other and even David himself in hopes of succeeding him on the throne. Was that great? The one who did manage to seize the throne, Solomon, ran with his success. He built a very great temple and an even greater royal palace for himself, dripping with gold, and a pretty nice place to house his hundreds of wives and concubines too. All of this was done at the expense of the poor and the foreigners whom he exploited for their labor, often uncompensated. Was that great? Jesus' family tree is looking less great, isn't it? And yet Jesus needed to be born in Bethlehem to prove his connection to greatness. But how do we reconcile such a rotten family tree with the Savior of the world? Interestingly, the prophet Isaiah avoided direct mention of either King David or King Solomon in his prophecy. Instead, Isaiah indicated that the Messiah would come from the root of Jesse's family tree. Jesse? Who was Jesse, and what was so great about him? Jesse was David's father. Jesse himself was no king. He was in the sheep business, which is why David was recruited directly from the pastures as the youngest son who was tasked with keeping the sheep. Now, David was a pretty good guy in his younger days before the power and wealth and the crown went to his head. But we don't really know much about Jesse, except for his most famous son, David, and his predecessors. You see, Jesse was the son of Obed, who himself was the son of Boaz. And that may be where the greatness of Bethlehem is to be found, because we know quite a bit about Boaz. Now that is a great story. And if you are not exactly sure who Boaz is, that's perfectly okay. But maybe you've heard of Ruth. There is actually a biblical book named after her, which is a cool thing in itself. And it's a really wonderful book. 4 short and fascinating chapters. I recommend that you read it. I will summarize the story of Ruth. Once upon a time, some people named Elimelech and Naomi had to leave their hometown of Bethlehem because there was famine, no grain to be found, even in the house of bread. So they left their country, Judah, as starving refugees, and they landed in a nearby country called Moab, just southeast of Bethlehem. They made a life there, and their 2 sons even married Moabite women named Ruth and Orpah. Everything was fine until the family patriarch Elimelech died, leaving Naomi widowed. For a time, she had her 2 sons to take care of her, but then they both died. What a family tragedy. Now there were 3 widows, Naomi, Orpah, and Ruth. What would they do? Well, by then, the famine back in Judah was over, so Naomi decided to return home to Bethlehem, and her dear daughters-in-law insisted on going with her. She insisted in turn that they should stay in Moab, where they had families to care for them and where they might still remarry and have a second chance as they were young. Orpah turned back and went to her mother, which seems perfectly reasonable. But Ruth, she stayed with old Naomi, telling her, "Where you go, I will go. Where you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God." Ruth could not be convinced to go back, so the 2 of them journeyed together to Bethlehem. There a living had to be made, so Ruth went into the fields to glean barley. Now, according to the religious law of the Torah, if you recall what I read from Deuteronomy, this was not stealing. That specific law I read to you, it required farmers to leave behind anything they miss on the first cutting, as well as leaving the edges of the fields unharvested, so that the poor, the widows, the orphans, and the foreigners, people without fields of their own, could get some produce for their own sustenance. Luckily, Ruth chose the fields of an honest farmer, Boaz, who not only honored the law and allowed the poor, widowed immigrant woman to glean, but also insisted that she eat and drink with his workers. Boaz even made sure that they left behind a little extra for Ruth to pick up. He also kept an eye out to make sure that no one violated the foreign girl working in his fields. He kept her safe. And because Boaz was a kinsman to Ruth's deceased father-in-law, he honored his obligation to buy the dead man's field and marry Ruth, so that any children she might have would inherit their family's own land. Boaz didn't have to do this. He chose to, because it was the correct thing to do. His radical hospitality to a Moabite woman kept Ruth and her aging mother-in-law alive, guaranteeing their survival in Bethlehem, house of bread. What a great thing to do. It's not at all surprising to imagine Jesus coming from such a family tree. Jesus, who described himself as the bread of life, who shared bread and showed love and compassion for widows, orphans, foreigners, and the poorest of the poor. Of course, Jesus came from the line of Jesse, son of Obed, son of Boaz, who faithfully followed the teachings of the Torah and let a poor widowed foreigner glean from his fields while also giving her lifelong shelter at his home and hearth. He may not have been a king, but he was pretty great. Greatness in God's economy is not measured by wealth or power. It is measured by humility and hospitality. It's the pure generosity of a barley farmer who humbly offered what he had, grain, so that 2 widows would have something to eat in Bethlehem, house of bread. Never mind that what he gave away could have been sold for extra cash. He apparently had enough and remembered that historically his own people had not always enjoyed such abundance. The teachings of the Torah insisted that God's people remember their own days of slavery. Boaz did remember, and in remembering, he gave generously so that even the young immigrant woman who arrived hungry in the house of bread should have some to eat. No wonder Ruth preferred to stay with her mother-in-law and align herself with Naomi's people and the God they served. What a blessing to be part of such a family and to serve a God that calls people to love one another, even those outside the family. What a great God. What a great family. Jesus' family tree wasn't great because it happened to include a couple kings. Jesus' family tree was great because of people like Ruth, a humble young widowed immigrant, and Boaz, a generous farmer who knew how important it was to provide hospitality even to strangers. Their story is perhaps the greatest love story of Bethlehem. It's also a story of humility and hospitality, and how often those two things go together. When I was a little girl, no more than 8 or 9 years old, something big happened in our little town. A flea market popped up at the fairgrounds. It was full of traveling vendors of all sorts of marvelous merchandise, and it was the best thing I had ever seen. I went with my dad, and while I only had eyes for the cool stuff, my dad found a greater treasure. A family from Mexico selling jewelry boxes and other trinkets made of etched glass. Now, my dad had spent several years living in Central and South America, and he leapt at the chance to connect with this family. He invited them even to park their trailer on our property for a couple days before heading to their next sales venue. And so it was that I spent a couple days playing with 2 kids about my age. They spoke almost no English, and I spoke absolutely no Spanish. But you know, kids don't need words. We had bikes. Mine was a crummy old garage sale bike. Theirs were even worse, more rust and no brakes. They were dying to ride my bike, so we traded. We screamed, I in terror, they in delight, as we rode those bikes down the crazy steep hill on the way to my elementary school, where we played on every single piece of equipment at the playground. They were amazed. I kind of got the impression they maybe didn't go to school, and I wasn't sure if that was wonderful or terrible. Their world was clearly very different from mine. When we got back, hot and exhausted from the uphill part of the ride, the kids invited me into their tiny little RV where the girl, her name was Viviana, she asked her mother if she could offer me something to eat. And then she asked me if I wanted a cookie, and I was very excited, but it turned out to be only a cracker. My parents later explained to me that Spanish speakers use the same word for both, galleta. Well, I was pretty disappointed that my galleta was the cracker kind and not the cookie kind, but standing in a tiny RV that was barely big enough for we 3 kids to stand up, I realized that family didn't have much, and yet they were offering me a treat. Be it ever so humble, my stale galleta represented the greatest gift, hospitality. As I ate it, I thought, maybe I should be the one inviting them to have cookies, maybe even milk, in my house, which was spacious and filled with plenty of food and even toys, just for me. I learned a lesson that day in a rickety old RV that housed a family of foreigners who were willing to share their humble bread with me. Maybe that is the lesson of Bethlehem, house of bread. There, even in the most humble place we can imagine, a place best suited for animals, a poor couple welcomed the presence of God into their lives. As humble as they were, Mary and Joseph opened their hearts to loving and raising the one who would teach his people to show hospitality, to give generously, to love God wholeheartedly, and to love every human neighbor as much as oneself. Of course, this child was born in Bethlehem, the little hometown of his great, humble, hospitable ancestor Boaz. It turns out that humble places can be the best places to experience the greatest love there is, the love of God as revealed through Jesus the Christ. May we open our hearts to giving and receiving that kind of love as we remember what happened in Bethlehem.